Recently, I was alerted to the existence of PSA submission returns with large numbers of consecutive Gem Mint 10 grades for vintage cards. I'm talking about lists with hundreds of PSA 10s in consecutive order. I'll go over some of these lists shortly, and they're linked in the description section below. I need to thank an anonymous friend for tipping me off to these lists. He was doing his own research to recreate past PSA submission returns, and noticed some unusual patterns in some of the cards he was tracking. We both started working on his lists, verifying certification numbers and tracing sales data back. The results blew our minds. A huge thanks to my friend for his tip and for all the hard work over the past month as we both put this together. Here's the first list, 253 consecutive 10s. I encourage you to open the spreadsheet so you can see all the cards for yourself. The submission starts with 40 consecutive 10s for 1973 and 1983 Kellogg's cards. Then it moves into a variety of vintage baseball, football, and basketball cards. There's a break in the middle where 10 autographed baseballs were graded. Then the string of cards getting 10s continues again. Here are 147 consecutive 10s for vintage basketball, mostly for 1974 Topps. The cards that are highlighted yellow are the only examples of 10s that have ever been graded by PSA. In some cases, these are one of ones. In other cases, the submission contains all of the 10s, such as all 4 of these Pop 4 1974 Topps Norm Van Leer basketball cards. The list concludes with a number of consecutive 10s for 1980 Topps basketball. In total, we have 253 consecutive 10s given for sports cards before we see the first 9. My friend then told me about a second list after researching 1984 Joe Montana cards. We were able to find 290 consecutive 10s in this list, which starts at certification number 815-96044. You'll notice gaps in the spreadsheet with blank lines. All of those blank lines represent a 10 as well. I've personally gone through every number to verify this. I just didn't have enough time to write out each and every card we found. This list also has a variety of vintage baseball, basketball, and football in it. Here's the third list my friend and I found. Another 134 consecutive 10s for vintage baseball, basketball, and hockey. These are all in the same spreadsheet linked below, just a separate tab. It's the same thing here. Every blank line has been confirmed as a 10. I just didn't write it out. With all these lists, it looks like these cards were graded around 2006 based on the sales data we found. You might wonder then if this is still going on today. I think it is. Here's a recent list of cards that my friend found. 77 consecutive 10s. Mostly for 40-plus-year-old vintage baseball. Almost all of these cards were sold by Rick Probstein over a 6-month period in 2019. I'm sure your next question is who's behind all these submissions. I can't be 100% sure because the sales data going back to 2006 is missing a lot of transactions. But the same names do keep popping up, and they are familiar ones. If you watched my video on the Eddie Murray PSA 10s, you saw that one of the PSA 10s was part of a submission of 31 consecutive 10s in a row. In that submission, there were 3 people who sold cards from that list of 31. They were David Rader, known as WC Sports 1, Joe or Andy Tuttle, known as Consigned Mints, and Rick Snyder, who operates Mint State Inc. If you look through these new lists, you'll see that these 3 names also show up a lot in the sales records, particularly for that list of 253 in a row. That's the most complete list, where I looked up sales for every single card in vintageprices.com. I have to stress, I don't have proof of who submitted these cards, because the sales data from Vintage Card Prices is very incomplete before 2009. I can just tell you that Rader, Tuttle, and Snyder's names show up a lot on these lists. After my friend and I put these lists together, I located another one of these golden lists, as I call them. This one is even bigger. 573 10s in a row, and it has an interesting story behind it, one that I think tells us a lot about the role PSA plays in getting these cards through the grading process. This list was uncovered in 2013 by a PSA member. He posted it on PSA's Collectors Universe forum, and he was quickly banned by Joe Orlando. It was reposted on Net54, and the thread is linked below so you can read the whole story behind it. This 573 card list is also linked in the spreadsheet below. As I go through it now, you can see some blank lines. Those certification numbers are not found in the database. What is on the list are vintage cards in all sports from 1961 to 1982, with a heavy concentration of vintage baseball from the 1970s. I checked the sales data on some of the cards, and all the ones I checked came back to a company called Pristine Paper, which I was able to link back to a PSA dealer named Peter Iskowitz. Mr. Iskowitz now runs a company called Sandlot Collectibles. His brother Lee is a consignment director for Heritage Auctions and was the former senior grader for SGC. So these guys have some pretty deep connections in the hobby. After this list was made public, Joe Orlando posted a statement. I've linked the whole thing below, but here's the part that's relevant for us. He says that some submitters will set a minimum grade for an entire order of cards, in this case a 10, and that only those cards will be graded. The rest of the cards will be returned without grades. That is why you see these lists of several hundred 10s in a row. Mr. Orlando also says that the customer will pay the grading fee on all the cards, no matter what minimum grade is requested. This seems reasonable at first, but let's go through the explanation. First, using Mr. Orlando's example, he says a submitter would have specified a minimum grade of 10, yet paid the grading fee for all of the cards, including the other 787 cards that didn't get a 10. Think about that for a second. Let's say conservatively the grading fee was $5 a card. Does Mr. Orlando really expect us to believe that someone would spend almost $4,000 on grading fees, only to have those cards get returned ungraded? Come on. Second, Mr. Orlando is basically saying that Peter Iskowitz sent in this large order to PSA with a minimum grade request of a 10. But that too belies any credibility. I could see that for modern cards, but look at the cards on this list. There's a ton of 1968, 69, and 70 vintage baseball. No one would ever specify a minimum grade of 10 for cards like that. A PSA 9 or even an 8 is well worth the cost of grading. It makes no sense. Let's dig a little deeper and look at what PSA publicly tells collectors like us about what happens when we submit our cards. Their website says a series of graders review your cards. In this 2015 interview with Sport Collectors Digest, Joe Orlando says that at least 2 graders examine them. In this 2004 post on a Collectors Universe thread, Joe Orlando says there is no preferential treatment given to dealers and that identifying marks are removed from the package. Later, in this promotional video, Mr. Orlando tells us again the same thing, that graders don't know who submitted the cards.
The cards are counted. The submissions are now assigned a generic order number, removing the identifying information from the order, thus removing the potential for bias.
When you look at all these golden lists of 200, 300, almost 600 PSA 10s in a row, do you really believe PSA when they say that at least 2 graders looked at all of these cards and that they had no idea who submitted them? When I was doing this research, one thing kept bothering me. I follow a number of collectors on YouTube who do PSA reveal videos. I'm sure most of you do too. A bunch of these guys have been doing this for years and have developed a really strong eye for cards. But when I watch their videos, these guys are rarely getting even 5 PSA 10s in a row, and that's for fresh, out-of-the-pack modern cards, to say nothing of 40-year-old vintage. So how do these golden lists even exist? In the course of my research, several sources approached me independently and confidentially. Without prompting, they each told me about a special arrangement PSA has with certain high-volume submitters. One of the perks they get is that they will send PSA a group of cards and tell them that they only want 10s on those cards. And they only pay PSA a grading fee for those 10s. Any cards not given 10s are returned without a fee. This creates a financial incentive for PSA to award these guys 10s. Otherwise, they don't get paid. Joe Orlando would call this a conspiracy theory. And he's right, it's just a theory. I don't have any solid proof, only the end result. The data from PSA's own records. But it does seem to explain the existence of these golden lists better than Mr. Orlando does. And it is a conspiracy. It's 2 or more parties working together to artificially manipulate the supply and value of graded sports cards. What do you think? Is the Only 10s Club real? Can you think of an alternative explanation for these golden lists? Post your comments and thoughts below. And thanks for watching.